Welcome to the History in Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one.
Before we begin, a warning. What you are about to hear contradicts what many people learned about African slavery. Not because it is a lie, but because the version that reached you was cut at precisely the most uncomfortable point. The history of African slavery has a part that teachers, documentaries, and major history channels on YouTube systematically skip. Today, that part will appear in full. The most common version is this. Europeans arrived in Africa, invaded tribes, chained people, and threw them onto slave ships. End of story. But that version omits a piece of information that changes everything. The majority of slaves loaded onto Portuguese ships were not captured by Europeans. They were sold by Africans, with agreed-upon prices, negotiated rules, and monopolies disputed between kingdoms. This is the information that rarely makes it into videos, classrooms, or documentaries on the subject. We are not talking about passive complicity. We are not talking about naive peoples who were tricked by colonizers. We are talking about kings who imposed their own laws on the slave trade, about kingdoms that fought to maintain their monopoly on trafficking, about states that declared war on Great Britain in the 19th century to avoid abolishing slavery. This happened. It is documented. To understand why, we need to go back before the Portuguese. To understand what Europeans found when they arrived in Africa, we need to go back before them. Ancient Egypt enslaved on a massive scale. Carthage trafficked slaves across the Mediterranean. The Ethiopian kings of Axum recorded with pride the captives taken in war. Slavery did not arrive in Africa with the Portuguese ships of the 15th century. It was already there for millennia, rooted and part of the political functioning of the great empires of the African continent. The trans-Saharan slave trade lasted more than 1,000 years and carried approximately 10 million people across the desert to serve in the Islamic world. The Indian Ocean had its own trafficking, with another 5 million Africans exported to the east. When the Portuguese arrived on the West African coast in the 15th century, they found complex empires with solid slave systems that had existed for centuries. None of these empires waited for the arrival of Europeans to begin enslaving. The Ghana Empire, from the 3rd to the 13th century, built a large part of its wealth trafficking slaves across the Sahara. The Mali Empire, the same one of Mansa Musa with his legendary gold, extracted that gold with slave labor. Domestic slavery was common. Mali imported enslaved women from the Mediterranean to serve in the houses of the elites. The captives came from military conquests over neighboring kingdoms. Slavery on the African continent had roots deeper than any contact with Europeans. In the successor empires, Jolof, Kabu, the slave structures continued. Ownership of slaves was a symbol of power and wealth. The more slaves a nobleman had, the greater his political prestige. In Benin, slaves were sacrificed in rituals to mark important dates, such as the anniversary of a king's death. This is not a European account about Africans. It is in the documents of the time themselves. It is on this continent, with this history, that the Portuguese arrived in 1482. In 1482, the Portuguese navigator Diogo Cao reached the Kingdom of Congo for the first time. What happened next surprises anyone who learned the simplified version. In just 9 years, the two kingdoms were formal allies. The King of Congo converted to Christianity. His son and successor, Mbemba Nzinga, baptized as Afonso I, brought the Christian faith to the entire kingdom, without invasion and without coercion. What united them was not force. It was the mutual interest of two kingdoms. The conversion makes sense when you understand the logic of African power at the time. The Portuguese could not invade the Congo. The kingdom had a population twice the size of all of Portugal. The initial contact was made by a few dozen Europeans. Afonso I embraced Christianity because he saw in it a strategically convenient alliance, political prestige, access to military technology, and a commercial partner. The alliance was not imposed. It was negotiated and accepted out of mutual convenience. With the Christian faith and the Portuguese language as a bond, the two kingdoms built a relationship that would last more than a century. Letters exchanged between the monarchs, preserved today in the National Archive of Torre do Tombo in Lisbon, document every step of this alliance. They are not accounts of conquest or resistance. They are diplomatic correspondence between kingdoms that recognized each other as partners, patrois, and that traded slaves with the same naturalness with which they exchanged gifts and priests. On March 5, 1516, a letter from King Afonso I of Congo himself reveals what this friendship produced in practice. He reported that he was sending to Portugal a ship loaded with 400 slaves through a Portuguese captain he had treated well during his stay in the Congo. 400 people on a single ship, documented by the African king himself in a signed letter filed in Lisbon. And this would be only the first of many letters about slaves. On May 26, 1517, Afonso I writes again. This time, he asks to buy a Portuguese ship to transport slaves without paying taxes. He wanted logistical autonomy in the very trade he controlled. The African king was not a passive victim of this system. He was one of its principal operators, and he wanted to expand his operational capacity. It is in the letter, with a date and royal signature. Less than a year later, an even more explicit request would come. The letters continue without interruption. On January 18, 1526, Afonso I thanks the Portuguese king for fabrics received. In March of the same year, he requests 50 priests for his kingdom. The relationship was multidimensional: religion, diplomacy, and commerce. At the center of the commerce, slaves. The Congo supplied. Portugal bought. Both profited. No document from this period records Congolese resistance to the trade itself, until, in July 1526, an unexpected letter arrived. On July 6, 1526, Afonso I writes an unexpected letter, not against the trade itself, but against internal competition. Portuguese merchants were negotiating slaves directly with other lords of the Congo without going through the king. These lords were becoming too powerful and beginning to rebel against royal authority. The problem for Afonso I was not slavery, it was who controlled it. And he knew exactly whom to ask to resolve this. Portugal had no way to impose itself militarily on the Congo. The only possible response was to accept the conditions imposed by the African king, and that is exactly what happened. The Portuguese crown prohibited the parallel trade and went back to negotiating exclusively with Afonso I. The king of the Congo had asserted his power over the trade. He dictated the rules. The Portuguese obeyed the African monarch. A few months later, Afonso I would formalize his demands in written law. On October 18, 1526, Afonso I formalized in writing a new law. Every buyer of a slave was required to appear first before 3 trusted officials of the Congolese court. Only they authorized the shipment. The African king had set up a slave customs office with its own bureaucracy and royal oversight. It was human commerce management, executed, regulated, and controlled by Africans, with Europeans as clients subordinate to the rules of the Congo. While the Congo controlled the northern route, Portugal found another supplier, Angola. And nothing irritated Afonso I more than seeing African rivals gaining power through the same trade he wanted to monopolize. In 1532, the king of the Congo himself formally asked Portugal to stop trading with Angola. In exchange, he promised more slaves, copper, and ivory than any other supplier could offer. Portugal accepted the proposal without resistance. The Regimento do Feitor do Trato de São Tomé, dated August 2, 1532, records exactly that. Portugal prohibits trade with Angola at the request of the king of the Congo. The African monarch had eliminated an African competitor using the Portuguese crown as an instrument of regional power. He was not being exploited by the system, he was using the system to consolidate his position. In less than a year, he had negotiated trade exclusivity for the second time. Afonso I kept the promise made to Portugal. Between 1531 and 1536, 20 to 25,000 people left the Congo, not counting those who died before boarding. The volume was so high that the boarding system simply could not keep up. People died waiting to be loaded onto ships, and the king of the Congo kept exporting, and would later complain about the lack of vessels to ship everything his ports produced. On December 4, 1540, Afonso I writes another commercial letter to the king of Portugal. He describes the advantages Portugal would have in continuing to trade with the Congo: open fairs, established routes, guaranteed paths to acquire slaves. At the end of the letter, he requests 5,000 cruzados, which would be used to buy more people. It was a formal request for working capital to expand the trade. Afonso I would die a few years later. His successor continued the same business. On May 7, 1548, King Diogo of the Congo sent a formal complaint to Portugal. Too few Portuguese ships were going to the port of Pimda to collect slaves. The owners of the pieces, the term used in the documents for the enslaved, were suffering losses because their merchandise was dying waiting at the port without an available vessel. An African king complaining about the logistical inefficiency of the trade he himself fed. Portugal received the complaint and responded. Portugal responded with a decree in 1553, once again prohibiting the Portuguese from trading with Angola. The document begins by calling the Congolese monarch "my very beloved and esteemed brother." In 1566, King Dom Sebastião sent a pilot to the Congo with 500 cruzados for the purchase of slaves. The language of the letters, through the end of the 16th century, maintains the same pattern: mutual respect, business, and progress. The Congo is the most documented case, but it is not the most extreme. To find the most extreme case, one must go to the coast of present-day Benin and move forward in time to the beginning of the 18th century. There existed a kingdom called Dahomey, and Dahomey did not merely participate in the slave trade. It built its entire state around it. Its military, economic, political, and religious structures all functioned for that single purpose. To understand Dahomey, one must know Agaja. Dahomey emerged around 1600 on the southern coast of present-day Benin. It gained prominence in the early 18th century under the warrior king Agaja, who used a trained and disciplined army estimated at up to 50,000 men at its peak, to conquer the neighboring kingdoms of Alada and Whydah in the 1720s. Those two kingdoms were the largest active slave trading centers on the entire West African coast. With them in hand, Dahomey controlled the entire corridor. With the conquest of Alada and Whydah, Dahomey took control of tens of thousands of slaves passing through those ports. In one stroke, it became one of the most formidable slave powers in recorded history, and the army that conquered those ports needed to remain in constant activity, which meant more wars, more captives, and more slaves to export. The logic fed itself. Dahomey needed to wage war continuously in order to exist. Dahomey enslaved on an industrial scale. 19th century estimates indicate that 2/3 of the kingdom's population were enslaved people. For one scholar of the subject, Dahomey was almost impossible to classify. Was it a gang of enslavers that became a state, or a state that existed purely to enslave? Both descriptions probably apply at the same time. And what made Dahomey even more singular was that slavery did not stop at the economy. Slavery in Dahomey was not only economic, it was religious. The annual rituals of the kingdom included human sacrifices of slaves to please spirits and protect the kingdom for another year. In some years, up to 4,000 people were killed in a single ritual day. The funeral of a king required mass sacrifices. Any significant social event could include executions. In this system, slaves were a currency of power between the king and the elites who competed for the trade. The ownership of slaves was a symbol of status among the elites of Dahomey, as it was in other kingdoms of West Africa. This generated permanent internal tension. The king wanted monopolistic control of the trade, but the elites built their own power bases through the slave trade. Not even the absolute power of the monarch was sufficient to contain the nobles who grew rich from trafficking. It was this state that the British tried to reform in 1818. In 1818, King Gizo of Dahomey was pressured by the British to make concessions, including the end of mass human sacrifices. In 1840, the pressure intensified for good. The British wanted the end of the Atlantic trade. Gizo refused. His response to the British representative was direct and without hesitation. The slave trade was the ruling principle of his people, the source and the glory of their wealth. The response was recorded. It is one of the most revealing phrases in this entire history. The slave trade is the ruling principle of my people, Gizo told the British. It is the source and the glory of their wealth. This is not a European colonizer defending slavery. It is an African king defending slavery of his own population that he enslaved and sold. This phrase exists. It is documented in British diplomatic records of the period, and it rarely appears in lessons about the Atlantic trade. The British pushed harder. Gizo did not yield. When the British managed to force a treaty that prohibited the trade through the ports of Dahomey, the kingdom simply redirected commerce overland to ports not covered by the agreement. Then it abandoned the treaty completely. In the second half of the 19th century, Dahomey sought an alliance with France, which was less insistent on abolitionism than the British. The kingdom did absolutely everything it could to keep the Atlantic slave trade active. The collapse of the trade destabilized Dahomey economically. The kingdom entered a spiral of wars and raids that ended up irritating the French. In 1889, Dahomey attacked a city allied with France. The French fought 2 wars and overthrew the kingdom in 1894, citing slavery as a morally justified cause for military intervention. The state built on slavery was destroyed by those who wanted to end it. The end came through war, not through repentance. Dahomey is the most extreme case, but it is not the only one. The Akan peoples in the region known as the Gold Coast, present-day Ghana and Nigeria, were prolific buyers and sellers of slaves. The gold mines that made the Akan rich in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries operated with slave labor. In some Akan states, it is estimated that up to 1/3 of the entire population consisted of enslaved people, taken from neighboring ethnic groups conquered in war. Among the Akan, slaves came from non-Akan ethnic groups. Any sense of African solidarity in the face of the European trade was practically non-existent. The ethnic divisions that separated the peoples of Africa were much older than European contact. One kingdom conquered another, sold the captives to Europeans, used the profits to buy better weapons, and conquered more in the next cycle. But not all kingdoms stayed in this cycle indefinitely. The Kingdom of Benin, not the present-day country, but a territory in southern present-day Nigeria, was initially a partner in the trade. In the middle of the 16th century, 2 rulers, Oba Esigi and Oba Orhogba, ended Benin's participation in the Atlantic trade and closed the ports to Europeans. For direct demographic reasons, the kingdom was losing men far too quickly. The case of Benin shows that African kingdoms assessed their situation and made political decisions, including the decision to leave the trade when the costs outweighed the benefits. They were not passive cogs in a European system of exploitation. They were political actors with real agency. Each kingdom responded to slavery differently. some selling, others banning, others resisting militarily. This diversity of responses is the clearest proof of that agency. The Congo and Dahomey are the most documented cases. But the trade that supplied the United States passed through another kingdom, the Ashanti in present-day Ghana. Great Britain dominated the routes of the 18th century, and the Ashanti were its main supplier. Ashanti warriors captured neighboring peoples, sold them to the British, and used the profits to buy weapons that sustained new wars of capture. The cycle lasted decades. The Ashanti did not merely participate in the trade, they grew militarily because of it. Each shipment of slaves to the British yielded firearms, gunpowder, and fabrics. Weapons allowed more efficient wars against neighboring kingdoms. More efficient wars generated more captives. More captives meant more shipments. The Ashanti expanded their territory over decades, using exactly this cycle, while the British bought every delivery without questioning the origin. What is today Ghana was known as the Gold Coast, not only for the gold, but for the enslaved people who left from there toward North America and the Caribbean. The ports of Elmina and Cape Coast were central points on the British routes of the 18th century. British ships anchored, the Ashanti and other kingdoms delivered the captives, and the ships continued across the Atlantic. Elmina had existed since 1482. It functioned as a trading post for more than 3 centuries. In the interior of present-day Nigeria, another structure fed the trade, the Aro Confederacy. The Aro controlled deep trade routes in the interior and used a religious oracle, the Ibini Ukpabi, to condemn people to slavery. Those who arrived seeking justice could leave in chains, sold by divine decree. The Confederacy had mercenary armies and a network of merchants that supplied the Atlantic ports with captives from hundreds of miles in the interior. In the 19th century, when the trade to the United States had been formally abolished, wars between the Yoruba states, Oyo, Ibadan, Ilorin, generated a constant flow of captives. These captives supplied the illegal trade to Brazil and Cuba, which continued for decades after the formal American abolition. Wars between Africans produced enslaved people. Brazilian and Cuban traffickers bought them at the coastal ports. The mechanism operated until at least the 1860s. While the Atlantic received British attention, the Indian Ocean had its own slave system, controlled by Africans and Arabs. The Sultanate of Zanzibar was the center. Sultan Said transferred the capital from Muscat to Zanzibar in 1840, precisely to control the trade. The slave market of Zanzibar operated on an industrial scale. Up to 50,000 people per year passed through there, sold to Arabs, Persians, and to the African interior itself. Great Britain pressured Zanzibar to abolish the trade for decades. The Sultan resisted with the same logic as Gizo and Dahomey. Slavery was the foundation of the economy. In 1822, the Moresby Treaty prohibited the trade outside the Indian Ocean. In 1845, another treaty imposed further restrictions. Zanzibar systematically violated them. Only in 1873, after the threat of a British naval blockade, was the public slave market closed. Clandestine trafficking continued for decades. The Trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean trade, operated by Arabs and Africans, carried more than 17 million people over more than 1,000 years. That number is larger than the Atlantic trade. It appears far less frequently in lessons and videos about slavery. The likely reason, the Atlantic trade involved Europeans as protagonists, and that narrative is more politically comfortable than including the Arab-African trade with the same historical seriousness. The Ashanti fought 4 wars against Great Britain between 1823 and 1896. The reasons were multiple: sovereignty, territory, but one of them was explicitly economic. The British were destroying the system that sustained Ashanti power. In 1873, the British defeated the Ashanti and included in the peace treaty a clause abolishing slavery. The Ashanti signed, and continued enslaving internally until the definitive conquest in 1896. In 1900, the British arrested the Ashanti king and attempted to take the golden stool, the sacred symbol of the nation. The people rose up in what became known as the War of the Golden Stool. When the British assumed total control, what they found in Ashanti territory were hundreds of thousands of people in a condition of slavery. Estimates indicate that between 1/3 and 1/2 of the kingdom's population was enslaved. The number shocked even the colonizers who came to stay. In northeastern Africa, Egypt under Muhammad Ali conducted an active slave trade from Sudan and Ethiopia. Military expeditions to Sudan in the 1820s had the explicit objective of capturing enslaved people for the Egyptian army. In a single campaign in 1822, General Ismail deported thousands of people. Egypt was simultaneously a victim of European imperialism and an active agent in the trade. The contradiction rarely appears in the dominant historical narrative. Sudan was for centuries a capture zone for multiple slave systems. The Sultanate of Darfur enslaved peoples from the south and sold them to the north. The Sultanate of Sennar supplied Egypt. When the Ottoman Empire advanced into Sudan, the trade did not cease. It changed managers. Peoples like the Dinka, Nuer, and Nuba were the recurring targets. Groups without centralized states, without armies, without the means to resist in an organized way. The most vulnerable always paid the price. Ethiopia, which was never colonized by Europeans and was celebrated as a symbol of African resistance, maintained slavery in an institutionalized form until 1935. When the League of Nations debated the country's admission in 1923, one of the conditions was a commitment to abolish slavery. Ethiopia signed and continued enslaving. In 1935, when Italy invaded, estimates indicated that 1/5 to 1/4 of the Ethiopian population was still living in a condition of slavery. Emperor Haile Selassie was celebrated in the West as the African leader who resisted Italian fascism. But when European powers debated his admission to the League of Nations, Ethiopia's internal slavery was the main obstacle. Great Britain and France pressured Selassie to abolish. He promised reforms. Internally, slavery continued as the foundation of the Ethiopian agrarian economy. The image of heroic resistance and the internal reality pointed in opposite directions. Liberia is one of the most disturbing cases. Founded in the 1820s by freed African Americans who returned to Africa, it was built on the premise of freedom. What happened? The Americo-Liberians established a rigid hierarchy over the native peoples, imposing forced labor that resembled slavery. In 1930, the League of Nations investigated and confirmed the practices. The president resigned. The country founded by former slaves had enslaved other Africans. Morocco maintained an active slave system well after the formal abolition in the Atlantic. The trans-Saharan trade that brought people from West Sudan and sub-Saharan Africa to the north continued with intensity until the end of the 19th century. Elite Moroccan families kept domestic slaves as a symbol of status. Formal abolition occurred in 1925, but domestic slavery persisted informally for decades. Records point to documented cases in Morocco as late as the 1960s. Mauritania formally abolished slavery in 1981, decades after Brazil and the United States. But only in 2007 was slavery criminalized. Until then, owning slaves was illegal but not punishable. Estimates from international organizations indicate that between 1% and 4% of the Mauritanian population still lives in some form of servitude. These are people born into families that have served other families for generations, without pay, without freedom of movement, without the right to refuse. African resistance to abolitionism was not irrational. It was exactly what would be expected of any power structure facing a threat to its economic base. The kingdoms that lived off the trade responded as any state would respond: negotiating, subverting, going to war. What is surprising is not the resistance. It is that it rarely appears in the narrative about the end of slavery. In 1890, the European powers gathered in Brussels to discuss the end of the trade in Africa. The Brussels Act was signed by 18 countries, what is rarely mentioned. The conference was necessary precisely because the internal African trade continued in full activity decades after the abolition of the Atlantic trade. The Europeans wanted to end the so-called Arab-African trade. The African kingdoms that profited from it resisted, and clandestine trafficking continued for years. The Atlantic trade depended on a logistics chain that went far beyond the coastal ports. In the interior of the continent, networks of African merchants captured, marched, and sold people along routes that could last weeks. Europeans rarely penetrated the interior. They stayed at the ports awaiting delivery. The violence of capture, the march in chains, the sorting at intermediate posts. This entire part of the system was managed by Africans, invisible to those who bought at the coast. American abolitionists of the 19th century knew that African kingdoms actively participated in the trade. Frederick Douglass acknowledged in his writings the complexity of African participation, but the abolitionist movement had an immediate political objective: to end slavery in the United States, and the most effective message was that of the passive victim and the European perpetrator. Historical complexity was subordinated to the political urgency of the moment. It was a strategic choice, not ignorance. There's another chapter that rarely appears. The 5 civilized tribes, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, were owners of African slaves before the American Civil War. When the southern states seceded in 1861, these native nations mostly allied with the Confederacy, precisely to protect their right to keep slaves. African slavery in the United States was not a system exclusively of white men of European origin. Among slave owners in the American South, there were families of free African origin and native nations. William Ellison, a freed former slave in South Carolina, became a slave owner himself. He came to own more than 60 enslaved people. He was not an exception in the moral sense. He was an exception in the statistical sense. American slavery was a system with participants of multiple origins. This information is not hidden. It is in the censuses of the time. It rarely appears in the lessons. When the American Congress prohibited the importation of new slaves in 1808, the trade did not cease. Ships continued to arrive clandestinely from West Africa, especially from Dahomey and the Yoruba region, until the Civil War. Every clandestine ship needed a willing African supplier to sell. Dahomey, which had subverted the British treaties, sold to any buyer. The American prohibition did not dry up the African supply. It only complicated the logistics of the operation. The Clotilda arrived on the coast of Alabama in 1860, illegally, 52 years after the prohibition of the trade. It brought 110 Africans captured in Dahomey. Captain Timothy Meagher had made a bet that he could bring slaves without getting caught. The Africans came from the same kingdom that had been resisting British abolitionism for decades. The Clotilda was set on fire to destroy evidence. The 110 survivors founded a community called Africatown in Alabama. The survivors of this Clotilda carried to Alabama the vivid memory of how they were captured by warriors of Dahomey, sold to the American captain at the port of Ouida. Cudjoe Lewis, the last living survivor of the ship, was interviewed by the writer Zora Neale Hurston in the 1920s. His account is disturbing. He did not hold anger toward the Americans who bought him, but toward the Dahomeyans who sold him. The question he repeated, why did they do this to us? Cudjoe Lewis and the survivors of the Clotilda personally witnessed both ends of the system, the African supplier and the American buyer. When they were freed after the Civil War, they had nowhere to return. The Dahomey that sold them was a foreign country. The United States that enslaved them was the only home they knew. They built Africatown with their own hands, maintained the African language for a generation, and were forgotten by American history for more than a century. President Mathieu Kérékou of Benin, during a visit to the United States in 1999, asked for forgiveness with shame and pain for the role that our ancestors played in the selling of other Africans. The declaration was widely ignored by the international media. Benin is the only African country to formally acknowledge the responsibility of its ancestors in the trade. Not by coincidence, it is the country that succeeded Dahomey. The contemporary debate on reparations rarely includes a question that the historical documents make inevitable. Do the descendants of the African kingdoms that sold those millions bear any responsibility? Kérékou's request explicitly acknowledged the role of African kingdoms in the trade. It was the first from an African leader. Most conversations about reparations in the United States still ignore this dimension, as if the African origin of the sellers were not part of the equation. At the port of Ouida, in present-day Benin, there is the route of the slaves, a historic path of about 2.5 miles that the enslaved walked to the point of embarkation. There is a tree called the Tree of Forgetting. According to tradition, the enslaved walked around it to forget who they were. At the end of the route, a gate called the Door of No Return. Benin has turned the memory of Dahomey into historical tourism. But the memory of who sold them rarely accompanies the memory of who bought them. Ghana, Ashanti territory, the main supplier on the British route to the Atlantic, created the Year of Return project in 2019, inviting the African American diaspora to return. Hundreds immigrated or visited. What few people know, Ghana is the country where the main slave castles of the Gold Coast are located. Elmina and Cape Coast, through which hundreds of thousands of people passed, captured by the Ashanti ancestors themselves and sold to the British and Portuguese. Elmina and Cape Coast are today UNESCO World Heritage Sites. They are visited by African Americans searching for the roots of their ancestors. It is a powerful image, and an incomplete one. Those castles were built by Europeans, but supplied by African kingdoms. The narrative tourists here is about the suffering of those who passed through there. It rarely mentions who captured them and brought them to the coast. The history of the castles is also the history of who sold. The documents are open. They are in Lisbon, in the National Archive of Torre do Tombo, compiled in the Monumenta Missionaria Africana, and in the Historia do Congo by the Visconde de Paiva Manso, digitized in the repository of the University of Lisbon. Each letter has a date, a royal signature, and a drawer location in the original archives. They are not ideological interpretations. They are the texts of the kings themselves in their own words. Anyone with internet access can reach them today. The letters show what they show. An African king sending 400 slaves on a ship, the same king requesting a vessel to transport more slaves with tax exemption, the same king complaining that his slaves were dying at the ports due to a lack of vessels, the same king requesting 5,000 cruzados in working capital to expand the trade, in a letter with a signature, with a date, filed in Lisbon. No interpretation transforms these documents into something else. The history that Africans lived during the period of the Atlantic trade is a history of victims and perpetrators, and in some cases, of the same person being both at the same time. The king of the Congo was Christian, allied with the Portuguese, an exporter of slaves, and a representative of a people who would eventually lose the war against European expansionism. This complexity is real. It deserves to be told without cuts. Denying the second dimension to protect the first is choosing one part of reality. When a video or lesson shows only the European part of this history, it is not protecting the memory of the enslaved. It is choosing which part of the past is acceptable to show. That choice has a name. It is politics. Doing history is different from doing politics with history. It is not possible to do both at the same time without distorting at least one of them. Usually both come out deformed. And the history that stays in silence also has real consequences. What you learned here does not contradict European guilt. It contradicts only the idea that the history is simple. The European powers were essential to the Atlantic trade. Without their demand, the system did not exist on this scale. The African kingdoms that supplied were equally essential. Without the local supply, the system also did not work. Both statements are true at the same time. Neither cancels the other. Both form the history. Slavery ended formally, but the silence about parts of its history still exists, and silence about the past is rarely neutral. It almost always favors some interpretation of the present. The antidote is not to replace one simplified version with another. It is to insist on the complete version, however uncomfortable it may be, even when it complicates the narratives we were accustomed to using. And the materials for this complete version are available to anyone. 12 million people were torn from the African continent over 3 centuries. Each one of them had a name, a family, and a place of origin. The memory that reached us about them was filtered twice, by the interests of those who profited from the trade, and then by the interests of those who wanted to explain the trade with the minimum amount of discomfort possible. Neither of those 2 filters served the victims. They deserve the entire history, not the version that is easiest to hear